Under the dim glow of a first-class cabin, Marcus Langston steps aboard, only to freeze as Vanessa Creed's voice slices through, dripping with scorn. "Guess they're letting anyone up here now." Passengers smirk, pegging him as an outsider. But 30 minutes later, the plane's grounded, Vanessa's fired, and Marcus walks off untouched. What they don't know yet, he owns Horizon Airways. This isn't just a flight gone sour, it's a battle for respect, and Vanessa's ruin will echo for years. How did it unravel so fast? Before we dive in, where are you watching from? If you stand for justice, hit like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this. Marcus Langston stepped off the jet bridge into the sleek first-class cabin of Horizon Airways Flight 119, Los Angeles to New York, with the kind of quiet swagger that didn't need to shout. His charcoal suit hugged his broad shoulders like it was stitched onto him by a master tailor, the fabric catching the soft overhead lights in a way that screamed money without trying too hard. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, clicked faintly against the carpeted floor, and the faint scent of his cedarwood cologne trailed behind him. He wasn't flashy, no gold chains or diamond studs, just a man who knew his worth and carried it in his spine. The cabin hummed with the low buzz of elite travelers settling in, leather seats creaking, champagne flutes clinking, and the distant roar of jet engines warming up outside. Marcus adjusted the strap of his leather briefcase, a custom job with his initials etched into the clasp, and made his way towards seat 1B, right up front where the air felt cooler and the legroom stretched out like a promise. He hadn't even reached the row when Vanessa Creed, the lead flight attendant, clocked him. She stood at the galley entrance, her uniform crisp as a blade, blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt. Her eyes, a cold shade of blue, flicked over him from head to toe, and her lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "First class isn't what it used to be," she muttered, just loud enough for the junior attendant next to her, a wiry kid with a nervous grin to catch it. The kid snickered, glancing at Marcus like he was some kind of exhibit. Marcus kept his face neutral, years of boardroom poker teaching him to let the first jab slide. He handed over his boarding pass, a crisp slip of paper with Langston, Marcus, 1B printed in bold, and waited as Vanessa snatched it like it might be contagious. She held it up to the light, squinting at it like she'd caught a counterfeit 20. "This looks off," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Scan it again." The junior attendant fumbled with the handheld scanner. "It's green, light flashing over the barcode." "Beep, valid." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but Vanessa wasn't done. "No, do it again. Something's not right." The scanner beeped a second time, same result. Around them, passengers started to notice, heads turning from their pre-flight rituals. A white guy in a pinstripe suit 2 rows back leaned over to his buddy, whispering something that ended in a smirk. A woman with a pearl necklace clutched her purse a little tighter. No one said a word to Vanessa, though. They just watched, like this was some kind of live theater, and Marcus was the guy who didn't belong. "Looks fine to me," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, the kind of tone that could calm a storm or start one depending on how you took it. Vanessa's eyes snapped up to meet his, and for a second you could see the gears turning behind them. She didn't like that he wasn't rattled. "I'll be the judge of that," she snapped, shoving the pass back at him. "We've had issues with fakes before. You'd be surprised who tries to sneak up here." The implication hung there, thick and ugly, and a few more heads turned. Marcus felt the weight of their stares, the silent agreement that a black man, in a suit this nice, had to be proving something. He adjusted his cufflink, a subtle flex of control, and slid the pass into his pocket. It scanned twice. "I'm good." Vanessa's jaw tightened, but she couldn't argue with the tech. "Not yet." "Fine," she said, stepping aside with a flick of her wrist that was more dismissal than invitation. "Go on, then." Marcus nodded, polite as ever, and moved to his seat. He could feel her eyes boring into his back, but he didn't give her the satisfaction of looking. The cabin was a cocoon of luxury, all polished wood trim and buttery leather, the kind of place where you'd expect the staff to kiss your shoes, not question your right to be there. He reached 1B, popped the overhead bin, and lifted his briefcase to slide it in. The thing was heavy, packed with contracts and a tablet for the merger he'd be finalizing in New York, a deal that could shift the airline industry's whole landscape. He was about to close the bin when Vanessa materialized at his elbow, her perfume sharp and floral like a warning shot. "Hold up," she said, her tone clipped and official. "I need you to keep that with you." Marcus paused, hand still on the bin's edge, and turned to her. The compartment was wide open, not a single bag inside, its emptiness mocking her words. "Plane hasn't even finished boarding," he said, keeping it measured like he was talking to a kid throwing a tantrum. "There's plenty of space." Vanessa's smile was thin as a razor. "Regulations. We're closing the overheads early for safety. 10 minutes before final prep, standard procedure. You'll have to keep it under the seat. I'm sure you'll manage." She reached up, her manicured nails flashing, and slammed the bin shut, with a bang that echoed through the cabin. Heads jerked up, eyes darting between them. The pinstripe guy chuckled under his breath. Marcus blinked, processing the absurdity, the bin still rattling in his ears. He looked at her for a beat, weighing his options. Call her out, and it'd be a scene. Let it go, and she'd think she'd won. He chose the middle road, exhaling through his nose, a quiet release of tension. "All right," he said, voice smooth as silk, and shifted the briefcase to his lap. It was bulky, not huge, but it dug into his thighs, the leather creaking under his grip. He settled into 1B, the seat molding to him like it knew who he was, even if Vanessa didn't. She stood there for a second longer, like she was waiting for him to crack, then turned on her heel and strutted toward the galley, her chin tilted up like she'd just scored a point. Marcus adjusted the bag, feeling its weight settle, and let his eyes drift to the window. The tarmac stretched out under the LAX sunset, all oranges and purples bleeding into the sky, a view he'd earned 100 times over. A minute later, another passenger boarded, a white guy in his 50s, all linen shirt and boat shoes, dragging a roller bag that looked like it had seen better days. He stumbled a bit, chuckling. "Whoops, late to the party." Vanessa's whole vibe flipped, like a switch. She beamed, teeth flashing, and stepped forward. "Not a problem at all, Mr. Grayson," she cooed, her voice syrupy sweet. "Let me help you with that." She popped open a bin 2 rows back, still empty, and hoisted his bag up with a gentleness Marcus could only dream of. The guy grinned, oblivious, and flopped into his seat. Marcus watched it all, jaw tightening just a fraction, the sting of it settling in his chest. He'd seen this dance before, the way some folks got the red carpet while others got the boot, all wrapped up in a smile and a rulebook. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from his assistant. "Merger docs ready. Call when you land." He typed back a quick, "Got it," one hand steadying the briefcase, and leaned back. The cabin filled up, chatter rising, glasses clinking, but the air around him felt heavier now, like Vanessa had just drawn a line he'd have to cross. He didn't know it yet, but that slammed bin was just the opening shot. Vanessa wasn't done, not by a long shot. She'd taken her first swing, and missed. But the smirk she'd worn walking away said it all. She was already planning the next one. Marcus had won this round, kept his cool, held his ground. But the flight was 5 hours long, and Vanessa Creed wasn't the type to let a loss sit. Outside, the engines revved, the plane inching toward takeoff, and Marcus shifted the bag again, its edges biting into his legs. He thought he'd handled her, thought he'd come out on top. He had no idea how wrong he was, how deep her spite ran, or how far she'd go to make sure he paid for daring to sit where she didn't think he belonged. The plane jolted forward, taxiing toward the runway, and Marcus Langston settled into seat 1B, the leather cradling him like an old friend despite the briefcase still digging into his thighs. The cabin lights dimmed to a golden hue, casting long shadows across the polished wood accents, and the hum of the engines vibrated through the floor. He adjusted his tie, a deep burgundy that popped against his charcoal suit, and let his shoulders relax for the first time since boarding. Vanessa's little bin stunt had been a cheap shot, sure, but he'd handled it, kept his cool. And now, he could focus. 5 hours to New York, plenty of time to prep for the merger that'd make headlines. He pulled out his phone, thumbing through emails, when a shadow loomed over him. Vanessa Creed was back, her silhouette sharp against the galley. Lights. A clipboard tucked under her arm and a smile plastered on her face that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Langston," she said, her voice dripping with fake honey. "We've got a little glitch in the system. Seems your seat's been double booked. Happens sometimes with last-minute upgrades." Marcus looked up, his brow furrowing. "I booked this 3 weeks ago," he said, pulling out his boarding pass again, the ink still crisp. "1B, confirmed. No upgrade." Vanessa tilted her head, like she was humoring a kid who didn't get the rules. "Well, the system says otherwise. I'm afraid I'll need to move you to 9C. It's just a formality, FAA regulations. Can't have 2 passengers in 1 seat, right?" Her lips twitched, barely hiding the smirk. Marcus held her gaze, his fingers tightening on the pass. "Check it again," he said, voice steady but edged with steel. She sighed, theatrical, and tapped at her tablet, the screen glowing in her hands. "Nope, still showing 9C. Let's not make this a thing, okay? Grab your bag and follow me." The cabin was half full, passengers sipping pre-flight drinks, but every eye swiveled toward them now. Marcus stood towering over her by a good 6 inches and held out the pass. "Scan it. Right here, right now." Vanessa's smile faltered, but she snatched it, ran it through her scanner. Beep. "Langston Marcus 1B, the device chirped. Her jaw clenched, a muscle ticking under her cheek, and the air between them crackled. "Must have been a glitch," she muttered, shoving it back at him. "But I still need you to move. Safety protocol." Marcus didn't budge. "Show me the rule book," he said, calm as a lake before a storm. She blinked, caught off guard, then pivoted. "Fine, stay. But don't say I didn't warn you." He sat back down, thinking he'd won, the briefcase settling heavy on his lap again. The plane rolled faster, the runway lights streaking past, the window, and he let out a slow breath. Round 2, his, or so he thought. 20 minutes later, the seatbelt sign flicked off, and Vanessa was back, her heels clicking like a countdown. "All right, folks," she announced, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "We're sorted now. Mr. Langston, 9C's ready for you. Let's go." Marcus turned, incredulous. "We settled this." She leaned in, voice dropping to a hiss. "No, we didn't. FAA says I call the shots on seating. Move, or I'll have security do it." The threat landed like a punch, and passengers perked up, some grinning like they'd bet on this. Marcus waited, the merger docs in his bag, flashing through his mind. He could fight, but she'd escalate, and he needed to land in one piece. "Fine," he said, standing, his 6'2" frame filling the aisle. He grabbed the briefcase, its leather warm from his grip, and followed her, every step a slow burn of humiliation. She led him past the plush first-class rows, where champagne flowed and legroom stretched, all the way to 9C, a middle seat crammed between a snoring guy in a tracksuit and a woman with a yapping lapdog. The galley loomed behind, its clatter of carts and faint whiff of burnt coffee seeping into the air. "Here you go," Vanessa said, her tone bright and brittle, like she'd just handed him a prize. Marcus squeezed in, the armrests digging into his hips, the briefcase wedged awkwardly between his knees. The dog yipped, the guy snored louder, and the woman muttered, "Great, now it's tight." Laughter rippled from the front, pinstripe guy from earlier nudging his buddy. "Guess he's slumming it now." Marcus kept his face stone, but inside, the fuse was lit. He'd taken the hit, moved, kept his dignity intact. What could she do now? Plenty, it turned out. An hour in, the drink cart rolled up, pushed by Vanessa herself, her movements sharp and deliberate. She handed out crystal glasses of wine to first class, all smiles and "Enjoy, sir," while Marcus watched, his throat dry as sandpaper. She reached his row, her eyes locking on him, and pulled out a tray of steaming coffee, the aroma rich and bitter. "Coffee?" she asked, voice syrupy again. "Sure," he said, reaching for it, but before his fingers could. Close, she tripped, her elbow jerking just enough to send the cup tipping. Scalding liquid splashed across his lap, soaking through his suit, burning his thighs like fire. He sucked in a breath, hands flying to the mess, the sting sharp and immediate. "Oops," Vanessa said, stepping back, her smirk barely hidden. "Tight space back here, my bad." The cabin erupted, gasps and snickers blending into a chorus of judgment. The dog lady yelped, "Watch! Watch it!" while tracksuit guy jolted awake, muttering, "What the hell?" Marcus gritted his teeth, the heat searing his skin, his suit now a sopping ruin. Coffee dripped onto the carpet, staining it dark, and his briefcase took a hit too, the leather glistening wet. Vanessa didn't miss a beat, grabbing a stack of napkins and tossing them at him like an afterthought. "Here, clean yourself up," she said, her voice laced with glee. He snatched them, dabbing at the mess, the burn throbbing with every move. His jaw locked tight, holding back the fury clawing up his chest. She'd gone from petty to personal, and he felt it, the sting deeper than the coffee. He wiped his hands, the napkins shredding under the pressure, and looked up to see her strutting back to the galley, her chin high, like she'd just aced a test. The passengers around him settled back, some still chuckling, others pretending it didn't happen. His suit was trashed, the merger prep stalled, and his legs ached from the cramped seat and the burn. He'd moved, taken the downgrade, thought he'd weathered her storm. But that spill? That was no accident. It was a declaration, a line crossed from mockery to malice. He folded the soggy napkins, set them on the tray, and leaned back, the pain pulsing in sync with his heartbeat. Vanessa had drawn blood, metaphorically and maybe a little literally, and he knew she wasn't done. Not by a mile. "Hey, what do you think about Vanessa's move here? Comment number 1, if you'd have called her out right then and there. Or number 2, if you'd have kept your cool like Marcus. Ever had someone try to humiliate you like that? Hit that like button if you're rooting for Marcus to turn this around, and subscribe so you don't miss how he fights back. This story's just heating up, and trust me, you'll want to see what's next. Speaking of which, how far do you think Vanessa's willing to go to keep Marcus down? Could she top that coffee stunt with something even wilder? The coffee stain on Marcus Langston's suit had dried into a crusty dark patch by the time the plane hit cruising altitude, 35,000 feet above the sprawling patchwork of California. His thighs still throbbed from the burn, a dull ache that pulsed with every shift in his cramped 9C seat, wedged between the snoring tracksuit guy and the yapping lapdog lady. The air in the cabin felt thick, recycled, tinged with the faint bitterness of spilled brew and the sharper edge of humiliation. His briefcase sat soggy between his knees, the leather warped from the splash, and he'd given up trying to salvage it for now. Instead, he leaned back, the narrow headrest digging into his neck, and focused on breathing, slow and deep, letting the merger numbers dance in his head to keep the anger at bay. He'd taken Vanessa's hit, moved seats, wiped off the coffee. He could handle this. 5 hours to New York, and he'd be free of her. Or so he thought. The cabin lights flickered as the drink cart rattled back into storage, and Vanessa Creed reappeared, her heels clicking down the aisle like a predator stalking prey. She stopped at his row, her posture stiff, clipboard clutched like a shield. "Mr. Langston," she said, loud enough to wake tracksuit guy and hush the dog. "We've got a problem. Your tray table's malfunctioning." Marcus glanced down at the flimsy plastic slab in front of him, sticky from the coffee and wobbling on its hinges. "Looks fine to me," he said, keeping his tone even, though his patience was fraying like a cheap rope. Vanessa's eyes narrowed, a glint of triumph flashing in them. "It's not. It's been reported as tampered with. That's a safety violation, and I'm marking you as a risk." The word risk landed like a slap, and heads turned. Passengers, craning their necks to gawk. The pinstripe guy from first class 2 rows up, snorted loud enough to carry. "Tampered?" Marcus said, sitting up straighter, the ache in his legs flaring. "I didn't touch it. You spilled coffee on it." Vanessa's lips curled, a smirk she didn't bother hiding this time. "I don't know what you're implying, but passengers don't get to argue protocol. Stay put." She spun around, her blonde ponytail whipping like a lash, and marched to the galley. Marcus felt the air shift, the whispers starting up around him, a low buzz of suspicion. He clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms, and waited. She wouldn't dare take it further, would she? She did. 10 minutes later, the intercom crackled, and Vanessa's voice boomed through the cabin, crisp and authoritative. "Attention crew, we've got a potential safety issue in row 9. Security to 9C, please." Marcus froze, his pulse kicking up a notch. The dog lady gasped, clutching her pet closer, while tracksuit guy blinked awake, muttering, "What's going on?" Footsteps thudded down the aisle, and a burly security officer loomed into view, his uniform stretched tight over a barrel chest, badge glinting under the lights. "Sir," he said, voice gruff, "step into the aisle. We need to check your belongings." Marcus stood, slow and deliberate, his 6'2" frame filling the space, and handed over the briefcase. "Go ahead," he said, keeping his cool, though his gut churned. "Nothing to find." The officer unzipped the bag, rummaging through soggy contracts, a tablet, a charger, all standard stuff. Passengers watched, some leaning out of their seats, others pretending not to stare. The pinstripe guy whispered to his buddy, "Told you, he didn't fit up front." The officer pulled out the tablet, powered it on, saw a merger spreadsheet and frowned. "This it?" he asked Vanessa, who'd sidled up behind him, arms crossed. "That's not the point," she snapped. "He's been disruptive since boarding. Check his seat." The officer shrugged, ran a hand over the tray table, found nothing but stickiness, and shook his head. "Looks clear to me." Vanessa's face tightened, but Marcus cut in, voice smooth as granite. "Told you. It's her mess, not mine." The officer nodded, handed back the bag, and lumbered off, leaving Vanessa fuming. Marcus sat back down, the tension in his shoulders easing a fraction. He'd dodged her bullet, proved her wrong again. The dog lady muttered an apology, tracksuit guy went back to snoring, and the cabin settled, or so it seemed. He adjusted the briefcase, its damp weight a reminder of her last strike, and let himself think it was over. Vanessa had swung and missed. Twice now. He could ride this out, focus on the merger, land in New York with his head high. But then, he caught it, a ripple of whispers spreading from the front, soft at first, then sharper. Pinstripe guy leaned over to a woman in a silk scarf, his voice carrying just enough. "She said he's unstable. Probably shouldn't be back here either." Marcus turned, slow, and saw Vanessa near the galley, her head bent close to a first-class passenger, a white guy in a linen blazer. She was talking, low and fast, her hands gesturing subtly toward row 9. The guy nodded, his brow furrowing, and glanced back at Marcus with a mix of pity and distrust. Vanessa moved on, weaving through the front rows, dropping the same quiet poison. "He's been a problem since LAX, she murmured to a woman with diamond earrings. "Unstable, you know how it is." The woman clutched her glass tighter, her eyes darting to Marcus like he might snap any second. The whispers grew, a web of lies spinning tighter around him. "Heard he fought the seat change," someone said. "Yeah, and messed with the tray," another added. He felt the shift, the way the air turned sour, the stares hardening. The pinstripe guy stood, stretching like he owned the place, and called, out loud and brash, "Hey, why's he even here if he's causing trouble?" Vanessa paused mid-aisle and turned, her face a mask of fake concern. "We're handling it, sir," she said, her voice smooth as oil. "Just keeping everyone safe." The guy nodded, satisfied, and sat back down. But the damage was done. Marcus felt the weight of every eye, every muttered word pressing in. His jaw tensed, a muscle ticking under his skin, but he kept still, hands resting on the briefcase. He'd cleared the search, shut down her accusation, but she'd flipped. The script turned him into the villain without lifting a finger. The cabin lights buzzed overhead, the hum of the engine steady, but the atmosphere around him was electric with mistrust. A kid 2 rows up peeked over the seat, wide-eyed, then ducked back when his mom hissed, "Don't look." The dog lady shifted away, her pet whining softly, and tracksuit guy angled his body like Marcus might be contagious. Vanessa strutted back to the galley, her heels clicking a victory march, and Marcus caught her glance, a flicker of satisfaction in her cold blue eyes. She'd lost the battle, but won the war, at least for now. His burn ached, his suit stank of stale coffee, and his reputation, The one he'd built brick by brick was crumbling in the whispers she'd planted. He leaned back, the tray table creaking under his elbow, and stared at the seat back in front of him, its tiny screen blank. He'd thought the coffee was her big move, a petty jab he could shrug off. But this was a knife in the back, twisted slow and deep. She'd turned the whole plane against him, made him a pariah in a space he'd paid for, earned 10 times over. His fingers curled into the armrests, knuckles paling, but he didn't move, didn't speak. Not yet. Vanessa had upped the game, gone from physical to psychological, and he knew she wasn't stopping. The merger loomed, his phone buzzed, with unread messages, and the flight stretched out ahead, a gauntlet he hadn't signed up for. What was she cooking up next? 2 hours into Horizon Airways Flight 119, the cabin settled into a restless hum, 35,000 feet above the Nevada desert. Marcus Langston sat rigid in 9C, the coffee-stained suit clinging to his thighs, the burn still stinging beneath the fabric. The tray table wobbled every time he shifted, a sticky reminder of Vanessa's last strike, and the whispers from her rumor mill buzzed around him like flies. The dog lady kept her distance, her pet's yaps now a nervous tick, while tracksuit, guy snored on oblivious. Marcus tuned it out, focusing on the merger deadline ticking closer with every mile. He needed to work, needed to shake off the mess Vanessa had made. His briefcase, damp and battered, sat between his knees, a lifeline to the deal that could reshape Horizon's future. He unzipped it, pulled out his laptop, and flipped it open, praying the coffee hadn't seeped too deep. The screen flickered, to life, dim but functional, and he exhaled, a small win in a string of losses. The merger docs loaded, numbers and clauses sprawling across the display, a $500 million deal he'd spent months crafting. He typed, fingers steady despite the cramped space, the glow of the screen cutting through the cabin's amber haze. Around him, passengers dozed or scrolled their phones, the tension from Vanessa's whispers fading into a dull murmur. He'd dodged her security stunt, kept his head above water. Maybe she'd back off now, lick her wounds, let him finish this flight in peace. He adjusted his posture, the seat digging into his spine, and dove into the work, the rhythm of it pulling him back to center. Then Vanessa struck. She rolled the drink cart down the aisle, her movements sharp and deliberate, her uniform still, pristine despite the hours. She stopped at his row, her shadow falling over the laptop, and leaned in just enough to make it personal. "Need anything?" she asked, voice smooth as venom. Marcus didn't look up, focused on a revenue projection. "Water," he said, curt, keeping it short. She nodded, reached for a bottle, then tripped, her foot catching the cart's edge. A can of soda toppled, silver glinting as it fell, and before he could react, it smashed onto his keyboard. Liquid gushed, fizzing and sparking, the screen flashing wild before going black. Marcus jerked back, hands flying to save it, but the damage was instant, keys sticky, circuits fried. "What the hell?" he snapped, voice low but raw, the first crack in his calm. Vanessa stepped back, hands up, her face a mask of fake shock. "Oh no, I'm so sorry," she said, the words dripping with mockery. "These carts are tricky. In tight spots." The dog lady gasped. Tracksuit guy jolted awake and heads turned, a fresh wave of stares pinning Marcus in place. He tilted the laptop, soda pooling on the tray, the acrid smell of burnt electronics rising. His merger docs, his lifeline, gone. He wiped the keys with his sleeve, the fabric smearing wet streaks, but the screen stayed dead, a blank tombstone to his work. Vanessa hovered, her smirk barely hidden, watching him scramble. He sucked in a breath, chest tight, and looked up at her. "Get me a replacement," he said, voice steady but edged with fury. "Now." Vanessa's eyebrows shot, up like he'd asked for the moon. "A replacement?" she echoed, folding her arms. "Sorry, sir, those are for verified first-class passengers only. You're in 9C now, not on the premium list. Policy." Marcus leaned forward, the tray creaking under his weight. "I was in 1B. You moved me. This is on you." She shrugged. "Cool as ice." "Doesn't change the rules. You'll have to wait till New York. I'm sure your little project can handle a delay." She turned, heels clicking, and rolled the cart away, leaving him with a soaked lap and a dead machine. The cabin buzzed, passengers whispering again, some chuckling at the clumsy spill. Marcus stared at the blank screen, his merger deadline slipping through his fingers like sand. $500 million, months of work. And Vanessa had torched it with a soda can. His jaw locked, knuckles whitening on the armrests, but he wasn't done. He yanked his phone from his pocket, the battery at 60%, and flipped on the hotspot. No Wi-Fi on this relic of a seat. But he'd improvise. He synced it to his cloud, praying the backup had synced before the crash. The signal was weak, cutting in and out, but the docs loaded, faint and glitchy. He typed fast, salvaging what he could, the tiny screen a lifeline in the wreckage. He'd outsmarted her again, found a workaround. She couldn't stop him that easy, or so he thought. 30 minutes later, the intercom crackled, Vanessa's voice slicing through the cabin like a blade. "Attention passengers, this is your lead attendant. We're experiencing signal interference affecting our navigation systems. For safety, we're disabling all personal hotspots. Please comply immediately." Marcus froze, his phone's hotspot icon blinking red as it shut off. The captain's voice followed, gruff and clipped. "Folks, we've traced the issue to row 9. Whoever's running a device there, cut it now or we're diverting." The cabin erupted, head swiveling, eyes locking on Marcus like he'd lit a fuse. "Get him off!" a guy in 3A shouted, his voice thick with indignation. "What's he doing back there?" a woman in first class chimed in, clutching her pearls. Marcus stared at his phone, the signal dead, the docs frozen mid-sentence. He hadn't interfered with anything, hadn't touched the plane's systems. This was Vanessa, framing him, twisting the knife deeper. He looked up, catching her silhouette at the galley, her arms crossed, a faint nod of satisfaction as the chaos unfolded. Passengers turned hostile, their whispers now shouts. "He's been trouble since takeoff," pinstripe guy called out, standing for emphasis. "First the tray, now this." The dog lady shrank away, muttering, "I knew he was off." Tracksuit guy, awake now, glared like Marcus had personally ruined his nap. The air thickened with anger, a mob forming in the tight space, and Marcus felt it closing in, a noose he couldn't see. He held up his hands, voice calm but firm. "It's just a phone, no interference, check the logs." No one listened. The captain's voice boomed again. "Row 9, last warning." Marcus killed. The hotspot, the screen dimming, his last link to the merger severed. The shouting died down, but the damage was done. Passengers glared, some muttering slurs under their breath, others shaking their heads like he'd endangered them all. Vanessa strode back, her heels a slow victory lap, and paused at his row. "See what happens when you don't follow rules?" she said, voice low just for him. "Next time, it's not just your laptop." She walked off, leaving him in the wreckage of her lie. His phone sat useless in his lap, the merger docs locked away, the deadline ticking closer with no way to reach it. The cabin settled, but the hostility lingered, a sour taste in the air. His suit reeked of soda and coffee, his legs cramped from the seat, and his chest burned with a fury he could barely contain. Vanessa had gone from petty jabs to outright sabotage, crippling his work, turning the plane against him. He'd pivoted, found a way around the laptop, but she'd shut that down too. Faster, harder, more vicious. The burn on his thighs was nothing compared to the fire in his gut now. She'd taken his tools, his time, his shot at the deal. What was left for her to break? 3 hours into Horizon Airways Flight 119, the cabin felt like a pressure cooker at 35,000 feet, somewhere over the Rockies. Marcus Langston sat pinned in 9C, his soda-soaked suit stiff against his skin, the burn on his thighs, a constant throb. His dead laptop rested on the tray, a useless brick after Vanessa's sabotage, and his phone, now a paperweight with no hotspot, mocked him from his pocket. The air buzzed with hostility, passengers still simmering from her, fake interference stunt, their glares cutting through the dim light like knives. The dog lady clutched her pet tighter, tracksuit guy shifted away, and the whispers from first class drifted back, sharp and accusing. Marcus kept his head down, jaw locked, focusing on the merger he couldn't touch, the $500 million deal slipping away. He'd lost his tools, his space, his shot, but he still had his silence, his shield. Vanessa couldn't break that. Could she? She could. And she did. Vanessa Creed slipped into first class, her heels silent on the plush carpet, and bent close to a cluster of passengers, a trio of white guys in tailored blazers sipping bourbon. Her voice was a low murmur, too soft to catch, but her gestures pointed back toward row 9, her head tilting with a pitying shake. The guys nodded, their faces hardening, and one glanced at Marcus, eyes narrowing like he'd spotted a threat. She moved on, weaving through the rows, planting seeds with every stop. "He's been aggressive since takeoff," she whispered, to a woman in a cashmere sweater, her tone dripping with concern. "A real troublemaker, you know the type." The woman frowned, clutching her wine glass, and shot Marcus a look that could have curdled milk. The whispers spread, a wildfire jumping from seat to seat. Marcus felt it building, the tension coiling tighter, but he stayed still, hands resting on the tray, breathing slow to keep the fury caged. Then it hit. One of the bourbon guys stood, 6 feet of entitlement in a navy blazer, and strode back to 9C, his buddies trailing like a pack. "Hey, man," he said, voice loud enough to wake tracksuit guy. "You need to chill out. We're all stuck here and you're making it worse." Marcus looked up, steady, his 6'2" frame cramped but unbowed. "I haven't said a word," he replied, calm as stone. "Just sitting here." The guy scoffed, crossing his arms. "Yeah, right. We heard about the tray, the signal crap. Stop playing victim." The dog lady piped up, her voice shrill. "He's been disruptive all flight." Tracksuit guy nodded, groggy but game. "Yeah, keep it down, dude." Marcus held their gazes, his pulse steady despite the heat rising in his chest. "You're buying a story that's not true," he said, measured, logical. "Check the facts. I've done nothing." The bourbon guy leaned in, breath sour with liquor. "Facts? You're the one they keep calling out. Maybe you don't belong up here." The racial edge in his tone landed like a punch, and the cabin went quiet, every ear tuned in. Marcus straightened, voice low but firm. "I paid for my seat." "Same as you. Sit down." The guy blinked, caught off guard by the steel in Marcus's words, and backed off, muttering, "Whatever, man." His buddies followed, grumbling, and Marcus thought he'd diffused it, turned the tide. He was wrong. Vanessa watched from the galley, her cold blue eyes glinting, and she wasn't about to let him win. She strode back, her clipboard a prop now, and stopped at the edge of first class, her voice carrying like a megaphone. "Excuse me, folks," she said loud and crisp. "I need to address something. This passenger threatened me earlier, right after the signal issue. I'm trying to keep us safe, but he's making it hard." She pointed at Marcus, her finger a loaded gun, and the cabin exploded. The bourbon guy spun around, face red. "Threatened? You? That's it, he's done." His buddies jumped up, fists clenched, and the woman in cashmere gasped, "Get him out of here." Passengers in coach craned their necks, a ripple of chaos spreading fast. Marcus stood, hands up, voice cutting through the noise. "That's a lie, I never spoke to her." But the mob was past listening. The bourbon guy charged, shoving Marcus hard, his shoulder slamming into the galley wall. "You don't threaten her," he roared, spit flying, and the racial slurs came next, ugly and raw. "Go back where you came from." His buddies joined in, one grabbing Marcus's arm, the other swinging a wild fist that grazed his jaw. The dog lady shrieked, tracksuit guy yelled, "Kick his ass!" And the cabin turned into a battlefield, passengers shouting, some cheering, others filming on their phones. Marcus twisted free, his suit tearing at the seam, and ducked a punch, his heart pounding but his mind sharp. He wasn't fighting back, not yet, just surviving. Security barreled in, 2 officers this time, their bulk filling the aisle. "Break it up!" the bigger one bellowed, yanking the bourbon guy back. Marcus stepped aside, breathing hard, his cheeks stinging where the fist had clipped him. The officers turned to Vanessa, who stood poised, her face a mask of fake distress. "He started it," she said, voice trembling just enough to sell it. "Threatened me, then them. He's out of control. Marcus shook his head, wiping sweat from his brow. Check the cameras, he said, steady despite the chaos. I didn't touch her. The officers hesitated, glancing at the mob, then at him. She's the lead, the smaller one muttered. Her word holds. They grabbed Marcus's arms, twisting them back, and he felt the cold bite of cuffs snapping shut. He stood there, cuffed, the galley wall digging into his shoulder, the mob jeering around him. Should have stayed in coach, someone yelled. Trouble from the start, another added. Vanessa stepped closer, her smirk flickering as the officers held him. Told you to follow rules, she whispered. Just, for him, her breath hot against his ear. The bourbon guy spat on the floor near Marcus's feet. The dog lady clutched her pet like a shield, and the cabin pulsed with hate. A storm Vanessa had whipped up with a single lie. Marcus kept his head high, the cuffs cutting into his wrists, his suit a shredded mess. He'd shut down the first wave, talked them off the ledge, but she'd turned it into a war, physical, brutal, and public. The officers dragged him toward the rear, past rows of glaring faces, the air thick with slurs and judgment. His jaw ached, his arms strained, and his merger, his lifeline, felt 1,000,000 miles away. Vanessa had gone from whispers to violence, from sabotage to a full-on assault, and he'd taken the hit again. He'd thought the signal stunt was her peak, thought he could ride out her spite. But this was a new level, a mob unleashed, cuffs on his wrists, and her standing tall, untouchable. The plane droned on, the Rockies fading below, and Marcus felt the weight of it all, the injustice sinking deeper than the bruises. What could she possibly do to top this? All right, let's talk about this insanity. Comment number 1 if you think Marcus should have fought back harder, or number 2 if you respect his restraint under that kind of fire. Has anyone ever turned a crowd against you like Vanessa did? Hit like if you're raging at her right now, and subscribe to see how Marcus flips this nightmare. This story's a roller coaster, and you won't believe what's coming. So, tell me, how do you think Vanessa's going to twist the knife even deeper next time? Can she get any worse than this? The cuffs bit into Marcus Langston's wrists as the security officers hauled him toward the rear of Horizon Airways Flight 119, 4 hours into the hellish journey from Los Angeles to New York. The cabin air at 35,000 feet tasted stale, heavy with the sweat of rage and the faint tang of spilled bourbon. His suit hung in tatters, the shoulder seam ripped from the mob's assault, and his jaw throbbed where a fist had grazed it. The galley wall loomed cold against his back, the narrow space by the lavatory his new prison, far from the plush seats of first class he'd paid for. Passengers gawked as he passed, some sneering, others filming with their phones, the bourbon guy's slurs still echoing in his ears. Vanessa Creed strutted ahead, her heels clicking a triumphant rhythm, her blonde ponytail swaying like a pendulum, marking his downfall. He'd shut down her mob, kept his cool, but she'd turned it into a cage. He stood there, cuffed, breathing hard, waiting for the storm to settle. Then Vanessa went nuclear. She stopped mid-aisle, clutching her throat with a dramatic gasp, her clipboard clattering to the floor. "Oh God," she choked out, loud enough to jolt tracksuit guy awake. "I can't breathe." She stumbled, grabbing the armrest of 3A, her face twisting in mock agony. The cabin froze, eyes snapping to her, then to Marcus. "He did this," she rasped, pointing a trembling finger at him. "That drink, he slipped something in it." The lie hit like a bomb, and chaos erupted. The bourbon guy leapt up, roaring, "Poison? He's a damn lunatic." The cashmere lady screamed, "We're all in danger." Passengers surged, shouting, some banging on armrests, others clutching their kids. Marcus stood stunned, the cuffs pinning his arms, his voice lost in the uproar. "I never touched her," he yelled, but it drowned in the panic. Vanessa doubled over, her performance Oscar-worthy, coughing and clutching her chest. "Help me," she wheezed, and the junior attendant, a skinny kid with wide eyes, rushed to her side. "Call the captain," she gasped, and the intercom crackled to life. "This is your lead attendant," she managed, voice shaking. "We've got a medical emergency, suspected poisoning, requesting immediate diversion." The captain's response was instant, gruff and urgent. Diverting to Denver ETA 20 minutes, paramedics on standby. The plane banked hard, tilting the cabin, and the seatbelt sign blazed on. Sirens wailed faintly through the walls, a sound Marcus hadn't known planes could make, and the mob turned feral. "Murderer!" a woman shrieked. "Lock him up!" the bourbon guy bellowed, lunging forward only to be held back by his buddies. Marcus's heart slammed against his ribs, the cuffs cutting deeper as he strained against them. "I didn't give her anything," he shouted, his voice raw now, cracking under the weight. "She's lying." The officers tightened their grip, one muttering, "Save it for the ground." But then a voice cut through, small but steady, from 8B. "He's right," said an older guy in a faded denim jacket, his gray beard bristling. "I saw her pour her own water. He never went near her." The officers paused, glancing at Vanessa, who was now slumped in a jump seat, fanning herself with a napkin. "You sure?" the bigger one asked. Denim jacket nodded, firm. 100%. She's playing you." The cabin wavered, doubt flickering in the mob's eyes, and Marcus seized it. "Check the cameras," he said, steadying his breath. "Galley footage right there. It'll show I didn't move." The officers hesitated, then the smaller one radioed the cockpit. "Captain, we've got a witness, requesting video check." Minutes dragged, the plane descending fast, the Rockies looming jagged through the windows. The intercom buzzed again. "Footage confirms," the captain said, clipped. "No contact. Stand down." The cuffs loosened, snapping off, and Marcus rubbed his wrists, the red mark stark against his skin. The mob deflated, muttering, some slinking back to their seats. Vanessa's head jerked up, her act slipping, a flash of fury in her eyes. He'd beaten her again, turned her lie inside out. He was free, or so he thought. She wasn't done. The plane touched down in Denver, tires screeching on the tarmac, and paramedics stormed aboard, their boots thudding like a drum roll. They swarmed Vanessa, who'd revived enough to sob convincingly, but her gaze locked on Marcus, cold and calculating. As they checked her vitals, normal across the board, she leaned toward the lead medic, voice a whisper. "He attacked me in the chaos," she said, tears welling artfully. Grabbed my arm, threatened worse. "I'm scared." The medic frowned, glancing at Marcus now standing by the galley, his torn suit and bruised jaw making him look the part. "You sure?" he asked. Vanessa nodded, clutching her sleeve where a faint red mark bloomed, self-inflicted but perfectly timed. The officers spun back, faces hardening. "Assault?" the bigger one said, stepping toward Marcus. "That's a new claim." Marcus raised his hands, voice steady despite the exhaustion. "She's lying again. I didn't touch her." "But," the medic pointed at her arm, the mark glaring under the lights. "Explains this how?" he asked. The bourbon guy piped up. "I saw him lunge." A lie, but it stuck. The officers grabbed Marcus again, cuffs snapping back on, tighter this time, and dragged him toward the exit. "You're under arrest," the smaller one said, "pending investigation." Vanessa watched, her smirk hidden behind a tissue, as paramedics wheeled her off, a queen exiting her stage. The jet bridge loomed, cold and gray, as they pulled him out, the Denver night air hitting his face like a slap. Sirens blared outside, red and blue lights flashing through the windows, and passengers cheered from the cabin, a twisted victory chant. "Good riddance," the cashmere lady called. "Should have known," tracksuit guy added, awake for once. Marcus stumbled, the cuffs yanking his arms back, his merger forgotten, his freedom dangling by a thread. He'd cleared the poisoning, turned the mob's tide with a witness, thought he'd survived her worst. But Vanessa had flipped it, from a fake emergency to a real arrest. Her lies sharper, deadlier, pinning him with a crime he didn't commit. His shoes scuffed the jet bridge floor, the officer's grip iron tight, and he caught a glimpse of Vanessa through the window, stretchered out, her eyes meeting his for a split second. That smirk, subtle but there, told him everything. She'd lost the poisoning gambit, but she'd doubled down, turned a defeat into a death blow. Assault was no small charge, not with her mark and a witness she'd coached. His jaw ached, His wrists bled, and his merger, his empire, teetered on the edge of collapse. The cops loomed ahead, badges glinting, ready to book him, and the plane sat silent behind, a tomb of his dignity. Vanessa had gone from mob to murder frame, from cuffs to a cell, and he felt the noose tightening. How much deeper could she bury him? The Denver airport terminal stretched out cold and cavernous as Marcus Langston stumbled off the jet bridge, the cuffs slicing into his wrists like dull razors. The night air bit through his torn suit, the coffee and soda stains stiff against his skin, and his jaw pulsed with a bruise from the mob's wild swing. Red and blue lights flashed outside, casting jagged shadows through the glass, while the two security officers gripped his arms, their boots thudding on the tile. Behind him, Horizon Airways Flight 1119 sat grounded, its passengers spilling out with murmurs of triumph. Vanessa Creed's stretcher rolling away under paramedic escort. Her fake poisoning had failed, undone by a witness. But her assault lie had landed, pinning him with a charge that echoed in the cops' stern faces. He'd cleared one trap, thought he'd survived her worst. But now he was here, cuffed and cornered, the merger deadline ticking down to nothing. He needed out, fast. The holding area was a stark box of concrete and flickering fluorescence, the air thick with disinfectant and stale coffee. Marcus sat on a metal bench, wrists free after a quick pat-down, his briefcase confiscated as evidence. He pulled out his phone, battery at 20%, and dialed his lawyer, a bulldog, named Carla Reyes, who'd pulled him through worse. "Marcus, what's going on?" she barked, voice crackling through the spotty signal. "Flight attendant framed me," he said, keeping it tight. "Assault charge, Denver PD's got me. Need you here." Carla cursed, sharp and low. "Give me 2 hours. Don't say a word till I arrive." He hung up, leaning against the wall, the cold seeping into his back. 2 hours. He could hold on, get free, salvage the merger. Vanessa's lie wouldn't stick, not with cameras and witnesses. Carla stormed in at 1 a.m., her pinstripe blazer sharp as her tongue, and tore into the cops with a stack of paperwork, thicker than a novel. "No evidence," she snapped, slapping down the flight manifest. "My client's clean, and your accuser's got no proof beyond a bruise she could have made herself." The lead cop, a grizzled guy with a buzz cut, squinted at the boarding pass Marcus had kept, 1B glaring in black ink. "Witness says he lunged," he grunted. But Carla cut him off. "Witness who? The drunk guy egging on a mob? Check the galley. Cam, it'll show nothing." The cops grumbled, but the footage request went through, and 30 minutes later, the grainy video cleared him. No grab, no threat, just Vanessa's arm mark unexplained. The cuffs stayed off, the charge dropped, and Marcus walked out, Carla at his side, the night air sharp against his bruised face. "You're good," she said, clapping his shoulder. "Go nail that merger." He thought he'd won, beaten Vanessa's assault frame with cold, hard proof. His phone buzzed, Carla handing him a charger from her bag, and he plugged in, merger docs still in the cloud. Deadline tight but doable. He hailed a cab to a hotel, the Denver skyline glinting under a crescent moon, and crashed on a stiff mattress, suit still reeking. Sleep hit hard, a brief escape, and he woke at 6 a.m., ready to fly out on the next Horizon red-eye. He showered, borrowed a spare shirt from the hotel desk, and headed back to the airport, his stride firm, his mind locked on New York. Vanessa was done. Her stunt had crashed and burned. He'd survived the cuffs, the mob, the lies. What could she do from a stretcher? Plenty, it turned out. At the check-in kiosk, his boarding pass wouldn't print, the screen flashing red. Restricted passenger. Marcus frowned, tapping it again. Same result. A Horizon agent, a young woman with a nervous smile, approached. "Mr. Langston, there's an issue," she said, voice trembling. "You've been flagged by HR. No-fly status, effective immediately." His gut dropped, the air sucking out of the terminal. "Flagged for what?" he asked, voice low but edged. She handed him a printout, Horizon letterhead stark against the page. "Disruptive behavior, Flight 119. Complaint filed by V. Creed, backed by crew testimony. Your banned pending review." Marcus stared at the words, the paper crumpling, in his fist. Vanessa hadn't just lied to the cops, she'd gone systemic, weaponizing the airline against him. He called Carla from the curb, the morning sun glaring off the glass doors. "They banned me," he said, pacing, the merger clock ticking in his head. HR complaint. Forged witness. Fix this. Carla cursed again, louder this time. "Send. Me the doc. I'll hit their legal team with everything we've got." He snapped a photo, sent it, and waited, the Denver wind whipping through his borrowed shirt. An hour later, Carla rang back. "Got the complaint tossed," she said, triumphant. "No evidence, crew statements, a copy-paste job. You're clear to fly." Marcus exhaled, relief flooding his chest, and booked the next flight, 10 a.m. to JFK. He boarded, no cuffs, no mob, just a quiet seat in coach, the merger back in reach. Vanessa's HR trap had crumbled, her ban lifted. He'd won again, outsmarted, her system play. Or so he thought. By noon, his phone lit up with alerts, a flood of notifications pinging as the plane climbed. He opened one, a tabloid headline screaming in bold, "Violent fraud disrupts Horizon flight, faces ban." His stomach sank, the words blurring into a nightmare. The article spun a tale of Marcus as a raging con man, attacking crew, endangering passengers, all sourced to an insider named Vanessa Creed. Photos splashed across the page, grainy, shots from the flight, his torn suit and cuffed wrists framed like guilt. "Sources say he's a fake exec with a rap sheet," it read, lies piled on lies. His inbox overflowed with hate mail. "Go back to the gutter. Fraud. Horizon's better without you." Each one a dagger Vanessa had sharpened. He scrolled, hands shaking, the merger docs forgotten. Clients texted, "Is this true?" His assistant called, voice frantic. "Boss." The merger team spooked. They saw the article. Marcus clenched his jaw, the bruise pulsing, and Googled his name. The story was everywhere, X-posts amplifying it. Horizon thug trending with memes of his face photoshopped onto jail bars. Vanessa hadn't just banned him. She'd torched his name, turned a failed arrest into a national smear. He called. "Carla," voice tight. "Sue the tabloid," he said. "Trace it to her." She agreed, but the damage was rolling, unstoppable. He landed in New York at 3 p.m., the skyline gray and looming, and checked his email. A leaked message from Vanessa to a crewmate hit his screen. "Should have stayed in coach. He's done now." The cab ride to his hotel was a blur. Hate, mail piling up, his phone buzzing like a hornet's nest. The merger teetered, clients bailing, his reputation a smoking ruin. He'd beaten the arrest, walked free, thought he'd outmaneuvered her HR play. But Vanessa had gone bigger, systemic, hitting him where it hurt most, his name, his legacy. The bruise on his jaw was nothing compared to the gut punch of seeing fraud next to his face online. She'd lost the ban, but she'd won the war, painting him as a monster to millions. His merger hung by a thread, his empire wobbled, and Vanessa sat somewhere smirking, her stretcher long gone. How much more could she take from him? Marcus Langston slumped in the back of a New York cab, the city's gray skyline blurring past the window as dusk settled over Manhattan. His torn suit reeked of coffee and soda, the bruise on his jaw a dull ache, and his phone buzzed relentlessly, with hate mail, a venomous swarm sparked by Vanessa Creed's tabloid smear. The Denver arrest was behind him, the HR ban lifted, but the violent fraud headline had gone viral. The Horizon thug, trending like a wildfire he couldn't douse. Clients were bailing, the merger teetered, and his name, built over decades, lay in tatters. He'd landed at JFK 3 hours ago, free but fractured, and now he stared at his inbox, Vanessa's leaked taunt. "Should have stayed in coach," burning into his retinas. He'd beaten her legal trap, thought he'd salvaged something, but she'd hit his reputation with a sledgehammer. He needed a lifeline, fast. He dialed Ethan Carver, Horizon CEO and an old college buddy, his voice hoarse as it crackled through the line. "Ethan, it's Marcus. You've seen the news. It's lies. All of it." Ethan's sigh was heavy, the kind that carried weight. "Yeah, man, I saw. Total garbage. What the hell happened up there?" Marcus ran it down. The seat swap, the coffee, the mob, the arrest. Vanessa's every move. "She's a flight attendant with a grudge," he said. and she's tanking me. I need you to kill this story." Ethan paused, then came back firm. "I'll dig into it, get HR on it, shut it down. You're a shareholder, Marcus, not some thug. We'll fix this." Relief washed over him, a thin thread of hope. Ethan had pull, could squash the smear, save the merger. Marcus hung up, leaning back, the cab's vinyl creaking under him. He'd won a round, rallied an ally. Vanessa couldn't touch him now. By morning, Ethan delivered. Marcus woke in his hotel room, a stiff bed in Midtown, to a text. HR reopened. The case. Complaints trash. You're reinstated. Fly whenever. He exhaled, the weight lifting a fraction, and checked his email. The merger team was back on, spooked but willing. The $500 million deal still breathing. He showered, swapped the borrowed shirt for a crisp white one from his suitcase, and headed to Horizon's Manhattan office, a gleaming tower, on Fifth Avenue. The lobby buzzed, suits and briefcases swirling, and he strode in, head high despite the bruise, ready to reclaim his ground. Ethan met him on the 40th floor, a corner office with a view that swallowed the city, and clapped his shoulder. "You're good, man. We've got your back." Marcus nodded, relief sinking deeper. Vanessa's media hit had stung, but he'd turned it around, kept his empire intact. Or so he thought. That afternoon, his phone pinged with a board alert, a secure email from Horizon's exec team. He opened it, expecting routine merger updates, but the subject line froze him. Emergency vote, shareholder conduct. His stomach dropped, a cold sweat prickling his neck as he read. Due to recent events compromising company integrity, the board has voted to freeze Marcus Langston's shares, effective immediately. Conduct unbecoming a majority stakeholder cited. Review pending. The words blurred. His 51% stake, worth millions, locked in limbo. He called Ethan, voice tight. "What's this freeze crap? You said I was clear." Ethan's tone shifted, hesitant. "Marcus, I tried. Someone got to the board, spun the tabloid mess as a liability. I couldn't stop it. The betrayal hit like a freight train." Marcus paced the office, the skyline mocking him through the glass. "Who?" he demanded, though he knew. Ethan sighed. "Vanessa. She's tight with Gerald Klein, board treasurer. Fed him a story about you tanking our image, merger risks. He pushed the vote." Marcus's jaw clenched, the bruise pulsing. Gerald, a silver-haired relic who'd never liked him, had the clout to sway the board. Vanessa hadn't just smeared him to the public, she'd gone inside, turned his own company against him. His phone buzzed again, merger partners pulling out. "We can't risk the optics." His assistant texted, "Clients dropping like flies. $500 million evaporated, his empire crumbling under a lie." He stormed to Ethan's desk, slamming the phone down. "Call Klein, now." Ethan dialed, speaker on, and Gerald's gravelly voice filled the room. "Ethan, this about Langston?" Marcus cut in, voice steel. "You froze my shares on a tabloid. Hit? I'm the reason Horizon's still flying." Gerald chuckled, dry and cold. "You're a PR disaster, son. Vanessa showed us the article, the ban, the arrest. We can't have that tied to us." Marcus leaned in, fists balled. "It's fabricated. I've got proof, cameras, witnesses." Gerald snorted. "Too late. Damage is done. Shares stay locked till we sort it." The line clicked dead, and Marcus stood there, chest heaving, Ethan staring at the floor. His phone lit up again, a leaked email from Vanessa to Gerald popping into his inbox, forwarded by an unknown source. "Langston's a liability," it read. "Should have stayed in coach. Cut him loose and I'll handle the fallout." The words seared into him, her smirk bleeding through the text. She'd lost the HR ban, watched him walk free from Denver, but she'd pivoted, stabbed him in the back with a boardroom blade. His merger was dead, clients gone, shares frozen, all because she'd turned a friend of a friend into a weapon. He'd rallied Ethan, thought he'd secured his place, but Vanessa had gone higher, deeper, ripping his financial spine out with a single move. He sank into a chair, the office silent except for the hum of the city below. His suit jacket hung, loose, the bruise on his jaw a dark bloom, and his hands trembled with a fury he couldn't unleash. The merger was history, his reputation a punching bag, and now his stake in Horizon, the airline he'd built from the ashes, dangled out of reach. Vanessa had escalated from cuffs to headlines to corporate sabotage, each hit more brutal, more precise. He'd thought the tabloid was her peak, thought he could claw back from the smear. But this was a guillotine, and she'd dropped it with a smile. The phone buzzed again, hate mail piling higher, and he stared at the screen, Vanessa's, words looping in his head. What was left for her to destroy? Okay, let's unpack this betrayal. Comment number 1 if you think Marcus should have seen this backstab coming from a mile away. Or number 2, if Vanessa's boardroom play blindsided you too. Ever had someone you trusted flip the script like Ethan couldn't stop? Here, hit like if you're screaming for Marcus to fight back, and subscribe to catch how he tackles this mess. This story's hitting peak chaos, and you won't want to miss the next twist. So tell me, how do you think Marcus can bounce back from losing his shares and his merger in one brutal swoop? What's Vanessa got up her sleeve to keep this war raging? Marcus Langston stood in the Horizon Airways office on 5th Avenue, the Manhattan skyline a gray smear through the 40th floor windows as night swallowed the city. His borrowed white shirt clung to his sweat-damp skin, the bruise on his jaw, a dark stain, and his torn suit jacket hung over a chair like a fallen flag. His phone buzzed incessantly, hate mail flooding in, the fallout from Vanessa Creed's tabloid smear, and the board's share freeze still burning through his life. The merger was dead, clients had bolted, and his 51% stake in Horizon sat locked away, a fortune he couldn't touch. Ethan's betrayal, however unwilling, stung deep, and Vanessa's leaked email, should have stayed in coach, looped in his mind like a taunt. He'd rallied his CEO ally, thought he'd stemmed the bleeding, but she'd gutted him at the top. Now he sat, hands clenched, staring at the skyline, plotting his counter-strike. He didn't wait long. Marcus pulled his laptop from his suitcase, a spare he'd grabbed from the hotel, and synced it to his cloud. The merger gone, but his evidence intact. Ticket stubs, boarding passes, witness names from Denver, all cataloged like a war chest. He called Carla Reyes, his lawyer, voice low and urgent. "Carla, I've got proof. Flight cams, passenger vids, everything. Leak it to the press. Flip this narrative." She didn't hesitate. "On it. I'll hit CNN, get the truth out by morning." He sent the files, the upload bar crawling as the hotel Wi-Fi stuttered, and paced the room, the carpet muffling his steps. By dawn the story broke, a headline blazing across screens. Horizon passenger framed by attendant, evidence clears name. Clips rolled, grainy footage of Vanessa's coffee spill, her fake poisoning, passengers corroborating his silence. The tide turned, X lighting up with "Justice for Marcus," and Horizon suspended Vanessa pending review. Relief hit like a shot of whiskey, warm and sharp. Marcus stood at the window, the sunrise painting the city gold, and watched his phone shift from hate to support. Clients texted apologies. "We're back in," the merger flickering back to life. Ethan called, voice sheepish. "Marcus." Boards rattled. "Suspension's just the start. She's toast." Marcus nodded, the bruise on his jaw pulsing less now. "Good," he said, clipped, and hung up. He'd flipped her smear, turned her lie into his weapon, and the world saw it. Vanessa was grounded, her career circling the drain, and he walked taller, the office air lighter. He'd won, clawed his name back from the gutter. She couldn't touch him now, not after this, or so he thought. That afternoon, his phone screamed, with alerts, a new wave crashing over his fragile victory. He opened X and his blood ran cold. His account, A. Marcus Langston Y, was posting, but not by him. A photo of his face photoshopped onto a mugshot, glared back, captioned, "First-class thug, caught at last." Another post followed, a fake confession. "I scammed Horizon, assaulted crew, all true." His followers, ballooned by the CNN. Story erupted, thousands retweeting. Horizon thug, roaring back to life. He clicked frantically, password locked out, two-factor bypassed. Vanessa had hacked him, turned his own voice against him, and the internet feasted. memes of his mugshot spreading like wildfire. His stomach churned, the room spinning as he dialed Carla. "She's in my account," he said, voice shaking. "Posting lies, killing me again." Carla cursed loud and sharp. "Cybercrime will trace it, lock it down, sue her to hell." He hung up, hands trembling, and checked his email. Threats poured in. "Die, fraud. Jail's too good. For you." Some targeting his sister in Atlanta. Her address doxed in the replies. His assistant called, panicked. "Boss, merger's off again. They think you confessed." Marcus sank into the chair, the skyline mocking him, gold turning to ash. Vanessa hadn't just hid his name. She'd weaponized his identity, turned his win into a public execution. He called his tech guy, Jamal, a wizard from his startup days. "Jamal, she hacked me. Can you stop it?" Jamal's voice was tense. "She's good, man. Used a burner VPN, but I'll kill the posts, reset you. Give me an hour." Marcus waited, the clock ticking, his sister texting. "Cops at my door. What's happening?" He replied, "Stay safe. I'm fixing it." But the fear gnawed at him, her kids in the crosshairs now. Jamal rang back, triumphant. "Posts down. Account's yours. Traced her to a Denver IP. It's her." Marcus exhaled, the flood slowing. But the damage lingered, his follower count tanking, clients silent again. He'd stopped the bleeding, thought he'd reclaimed his voice. Then his phone rang, a blocked number, and Vanessa's voice slithered through, low and venomous. "You'll never fly again, Langston. I've got more where that came from." The line clicked dead, a burner phone taunt that chilled his spine. He stared at the screen, the city humming below, and felt the noose tighten. His sister's safety, his merger, his name, all dangling by threads she kept cutting. The CNN story had cleared him, suspension had clipped her wings, but she'd struck back, digital and personal, turning his triumph into terror. His bruise ached, his hands shook, and the hotel room felt like a cage. She'd lost her job, her grip on Horizon, but she'd gone rogue, hitting him where cameras couldn't save him. He stood, pacing again, the carpet wearing thin under his steps. His sister's kids flashed in his mind, their faces in the doxed posts, and his chest burned with a rage he couldn't unleash. The merger was a ghost, his reputation a punching bag again, and Vanessa's voice echoed, a promise of more pain. He'd thought the press win was his shield, thought he'd buried her with truth, but this was a viral guillotine, and she'd swung it with glee, endangering his family, shredding his life. The phone buzzed, another threat. "Watch your back." And he gripped it, knuckles pale. Vanessa had escalated from boardrooms to cyberwar, from lies to threats, and he felt the ground crumbling. What could she possibly do to make this worse? Marcus Langston stood in his midtown hotel room, the Manhattan night pressing against the windows like a heavy shroud, the city's hum a distant roar. His borrowed shirt was sweat-soaked, the bruise on his jaw a throbbing reminder of the flight, and his phone sat silent now. The flood of threats slowed after Jamal killed Vanessa Creed's hack. His sister was safe. Cops posted at her Atlanta door, but the merger was dead, his reputation a shredded mess, and his Horizon shares still frozen. Vanessa's burner call, "You'll never fly again," rang in his ears, a promise he couldn't shake. He'd flipped the press narrative, shut down her cyberstrike, thought he'd bought breathing room. Now he paced, the carpet fraying, under his steps, and dialed Carla Reyes. "Sue Horizon," he said, voice tight. "Breach of trust, defamation, all of it. End this." Carla didn't flinch. "Filing tomorrow," she said, crisp and fierce. "We've got footage, leaks, her IP trace. They'll settle or bleed." The call ended, and Marcus sank into a chair, the skyline glinting cold outside. By noon the next day, the lawsuit hit, a $50 million claim slamming Horizon's board, Vanessa named as co-defendant. The press pounced, Langston strikes back trending, and Horizon caved fast, offering a settlement, $10 million, and Vanessa's termination, effective immediately. Marcus took it, the wire hitting his account by dusk, her wings clipped for good. He stood at the window, the sun dipping low, and felt the weight lift. A jagged victory carved from chaos. She was fired, broke, done. He'd won, buried her career, in the rubble of her lies. Or so he thought. 2 days later, Marcus stepped out of the hotel, a crisp navy suit replacing the torn one, heading to a CNN interview to seal his redemption. The street buzzed, cabs honking, pedestrians weaving, and he felt the air shift, a new start within reach. His rental car, a sleek black sedan parked curbside, gleamed under the noon sun, keys in hand from the valet. He slid in, the leather cool, against his back, and started the engine. The merger gone, but his name rising from the ashes. The interview was 10 blocks away, a chance to tell his story, reclaim his ground. He pulled into traffic, the city pulsing around him, and turned onto 6th Avenue, the skyline towering ahead. Then it hit. A squad car screeched up behind him, lights blazing, siren wailing like a banshee. Marcus frowned, easing to the curb, hands on the wheel as 2 cops stormed out, guns drawn. "Out of the vehicle!" The bigger one barked, a beefy guy with a buzz cut, his partner flanking him, tense and wiry. Marcus stepped out, slow and steady, voice calm. "What's this about?" The big cop grabbed his arm, twisting it back, cuffs snapping on. "Drug possession, intent to distribute. Found a kilo in your trunk." Marcus's gut dropped, the words a punch to the chest. "That's impossible," he said, firm despite the shock. "I don't touch that stuff." The wiry cop smirked, popping the trunk, and there it was, a brick of white powder in a clear bag, glaring under the sun. The street froze, passers-by gawking, phones out, filming the takedown. "Marcus Langston, you're under arrest," the big cop said, shoving him toward the squad car. 20 years if it sticks." Marcus's mind raced, the cuffs cutting into his wrists, the settlement money useless now. "It's a setup," he said, voice rising. "Check the car, I just..." "Got it." The cops ignored him, slamming the door, and the siren blared as they peeled out. The sedan left curbside like a crime scene. At the precinct, a concrete box stinking of bleach, they booked him, print smudged, mugshot snapped. The real one this time. He called Carla from a holding cell, the line crackling. "Planted drugs," he said, low and urgent. "Vanessa, get me out." She swore, fierce. "Bailing you now, tracing it, hold tight." Carla arrived in an hour, a whirlwind in pinstripes, and posted bail, $200,000 cash, the settlement's first dent. Marcus walked out, wrists raw, the navy suit wrinkled, and climbed into her car, the city a blur outside. "Rental records show it was clean," she said, handing him a tablet. "Valet swapped keys 2 minutes before you left. Security cam caught a woman, blonde, slipping something in. It's her." Marcus stared at the grainy still, Vanessa's face smirking under a cap, the bag in her hand. "She's fired," he said, voice hollow. "How's she pulling this?" Carla's eyes narrowed. "She's desperate, gone rogue. I'll get the charges dropped, nail her for tampering." By nightfall, the evidence hit the DA, the valet confessed to a bribe, and the case collapsed. Marcus free again. He thought it was over, the frame-up undone, Vanessa's last gasp snuffed, out. He crashed at Carla's safe house, a Queens brownstone, exhaustion pulling him under. But at dawn, his phone screamed, a news alert jolting him awake. "Langston caught in drug bust live on CNN," the headline blared, his arrest video looping, the interview slot now a circus. The anchor smirked, "From hero to zero in hours." His sister texted, "More threats, kids scared," and his chest burned, the air sucking out of the room. He'd beaten the charge, walked free, but Vanessa wasn't done. A black SUV roared past the brownstone, swerving close, and he ducked, instinct kicking in. Minutes later, it came back, tires screeching, and rammed his parked rental off the curb, the car tumbling into a ditch, metal crunching like bones. Marcus dove behind the couch, glass shattering as the SUV peeled out, a brick through the window landing at his feet. "Next time you're in it," scrawled in red. His breath hitched, heart slamming, the ditch 50 feet deep outside, water pooling in the wreckage. Carla burst in, gun drawn, and pulled him up, her face pale. "She hired someone," she said, voice shaking. "Attempted murder now." Marcus stood, legs trembling, the navy suit speckled with glass. His sister's kids, the merger, his name, all targets, and now his life hung by a thread. He'd won the lawsuit, crushed her career, beaten the drugs, but Vanessa had gone lethal, a thug's wheel her new weapon, staging a crash that nearly took him out. He stared at the brick, the red ink bleeding into the floor, and felt the rage boil over, a fire he couldn't douse. The settlement was a hollow win, his freedom a mirage, and Vanessa's smirk loomed in every shadow. She'd lost Horizon, lost her grip, but she'd turned to blood, pushing him to death's edge. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Told you I had more," and he gripped it, knuckles white. The brownstone creaked, the ditch outside a grave he'd dodged, and he knew she wasn't stopping. She'd escalated from hacks to hits, from lies to a literal wrecking ball. How much closer could she get to ending him? Marcus Langston crouched behind the couch in Carla's Queen's brownstone, glass crunching under his knees, the dawn light filtering through shattered windows. The brick with "Next time you're in it" scrawled in red lay at his feet, a taunt from Vanessa Creed after her thug rammed his rental car into a 50-foot ditch outside. His navy suit was speckled with shards, the bruise on his jaw a pulsing ache, and his breath came in sharp bursts, the near miss of death still rattling his bones. His sister's kids were under threat, his merger long dead, his Horizon shares frozen, and his name dragged through viral mud. The $10 million settlement sat in his account, a hollow win against Vanessa's escalating war, from hacks to drugs to this, a literal hit. He'd beaten her frame up, walked free from the precinct, but she'd pushed him to the edge of a grave. Now in a hospital bed at St. Luke's, hooked to an IV for a cracked rib from the crash, he fought back. Carla stood guard, her gun holstered, eyes scanning the street through the blinds. "She's gone full psycho," she said, voice low and fierce. "Cops are on it, but we need her buried." Marcus nodded, pain shooting through his side, and pulled his laptop from the suitcase Carla had salvaged. The IV tugged at his arm, but his fingers flew, digging into Vanessa's past. He'd built an empire on research, on knowing his enemies, and now he turned that lens on her. Hacking into Horizon's HR database with a backdoor he'd kept from his shareholder days, he found gold. 3 complaints, buried deep, all from black passengers she'd targeted. Reassigned seats, false accusations, one even claiming she'd planted a vape pen to get them banned. Each case hushed up, her record scrubbed by a sympathetic exec. He kept digging, the hospital monitor beeping steady beside him, and hit a vein. A whistleblower email from 2 years back, forwarded to a now-fired HR rep, detailed Vanessa's pattern of misconduct, linking her to Gerald Klein, the board treasurer who'd frozen his shares. "She's his niece," it read. "Gets away with everything." Marcus's jaw tightened, the pieces snapping into place. Vanessa wasn't just a rogue attendant, she was a protected predator, her spite fueled by family ties he'd never suspected. He called Jamal, his tech guy, voice hoarse through the hospital line. "Jamal, I've got her dirt. HR files, complaints, Klein connection. Leak it, flood the net." Jamal whistled, low and impressed. "Give me 2 hours, boss. She's toast." The leak hit at noon, a digital tsunami crashing over Vanessa's world. Marcus watched from his bed, the IV dripping slow, as X erupted with "Vanessa exposed," the complaints plastered across every platform. News outlets pounced. Horizon attendants' racist past unveiled, linking her to Klein. The board's dirty laundry aired in HD. Horizon's stock dipped 5 points, shareholders howling, and Gerald resigned within the hour, a terse personal reason statement doing nothing to stem the bleed. Vanessa's termination went from temporary to permanent, her name blacked out of the system, her career a smoking crater. Marcus leaned back, the hospital pillow stiff under his neck, and felt the shift, a tide turning in his favor. He'd flipped her game, turned her secrets into shrapnel, and she was done. Or so he thought. That night, cops raided a Denver motel, tracing the SUV's plates to a lowlife named Rico, a hired thug with a rap sheet longer than the flight log. He sang fast, Vanessa's name spilling out. She paid me $5,000 to ram him, said he'd ruined her. The arrest hit the wires. Creed charged with attempted murder. Her mugshot, real this time, splashing across screens, her blonde hair limp, her smirk gone. Marcus watched the feed on his laptop, the hospital room dim, and felt the cuffs of justice snap on her wrists, a mirror to his own in Denver. Carla burst in, triumphant. "They've got her, Marcus. Locked up, no bail, you nailed her." He nodded, the cracked rib aching less now, and thought it was over. She'd swung her last punch, and he'd knocked her out cold. But Vanessa wasn't finished. As cops hauled her to county lockup, she screamed through the bars, her voice raw and wild. "I'm not done with you, Langston. I've got one more move." The outburst made the news, a viral clip of her thrashing, eyes blazing, and Marcus's gut twisted, the hospital monitor spiking with his pulse. He'd exposed her, stripped her power, watched her crash and burn. But that scream, that promise, gnawed at him. He called Carla, voice steady despite the dread. "She's bluffing, right? Locked up, what can she do?" Carla paused, then said, "She's desperate, but she's got nothing. We've got her calls tapped, her accounts frozen. Relax." He hung up, the room silent except for the IV's drip, and stared at the ceiling, the clip replaying in his head. His sister texted, "Kids are safe, cops staying," and he exhaled, the weight easing a fraction. The settlement money sat untouched, his shares still locked, but his name was climbing back. Justice for Marcus, trending stronger now. Horizon's board emailed, groveling, "Reviewing your status. Expect reinstatement soon." He'd turned her war into his win, her past into his sword, and she sat in a cell, raging but powerless. The hospital hummed around him, nurses bustling, the city waking outside, and he let himself believe it, let the victory sink in. Vanessa had pushed him to death's door, from cuffs to a ditch, but he'd struck back, hard and final. Her scream was empty noise, a last gasp from a broken woman. Yet the dread lingered, a cold thread in his chest. He replayed her words, "One more move," and saw her eyes, unhinged, burning through the screen. He'd thought the drugs were, her peak thought the crash was her endgame, but that scream held weight, a promise he couldn't dismiss. His rib ached, the IV tugged, and his phone buzzed with a news update. Creed denied bail, vows revenge. He gripped the bed rail, knuckles, paling the room closing in. She'd lost everything, her job, her freedom, her uncle's shield. But she'd planted a seed, a final threat he couldn't see. The counterstrike had crushed her, but her shadow loomed, a ghost in the cell block. What could she pull from behind bars? Vanessa Creed's final move landed like a bomb 3 days after her arrest, a forged video hitting X from a burner account, showing Marcus confessing to Horizon fraud, his voice eerily mimicked. The stock tanked 10 points overnight, shareholders panicking, but Marcus had seen it coming. From his hospital bed, he'd tasked Jamal to trace her jail calls, catching her hiring a deepfake tech with smuggled cash. Live on CNN, he exposed her, airing the intercepted audio, her venomous plot, unraveling as viewers gaped. Vanessa was slapped with new charges, her cell now solitary, while Horizon begged Marcus back as CEO, shares restored. He declined, sold his stake for $2 billion, and walked away, vowing, "I'll build my own sky." The airline faltered without him, a poetic collapse as he stood atop his empire, unbroken, the city his canvas. Vanessa's ruin was his rise, a twist she'd never foreseen. Marcus Langston's journey aboard Horizon Airways Flight 119 is a raw testament to resilience in the face of unrelenting racial injustice. The first lesson screams loud. Systemic bias doesn't just sting, it strikes with calculated venom, as Vanessa Creed wielded her position to dismantle Marcus's dignity, career, and nearly his life. Yet his story teaches us that silence isn't surrender. His patience, paired with sharp intellect, turned her attacks into his ammunition. Every coffee spill, every false arrest, every viral lie she spun became a stepping stone when he flipped the script with evidence and grit. It's a brutal reminder that racism often hides behind protocol, privilege, and power, but it crumbles under scrutiny when you've got the truth on your side. The second lesson hits deeper. Justice isn't handed out. It's clawed back. Marcus didn't wait for apologies or allies. He dug into Vanessa's past, exposed her, and built his own victory from the wreckage. His refusal to bow, even as she escalated from mockery to attempted murder, shows that strength isn't loud, it's strategic. Finally, his exit, selling his shares for billions and leaving Horizon to falter, teaches us that real power isn't clinging to a broken system. It's creating your own. Vanessa's downfall wasn't just her arrest, it was Marcus rising above her ruin untouchable. So what's the takeaway? Fight smart, not just hard, and never let hate define your worth. Now let's hear from you. Comment below. Have you ever turned someone's attack into your win? Hit like if Marcus's comeback fired you up, subscribe for more stories of grit, and share this if you believe truth can topple tyranny. Thanks for riding this roller coaster with us. Here's to building your own sky, unbroken and bold.